this is Matthew with BI Polar. In today's data culture video, we're going to talk about one of the most important but often undervalued aspects of building and sustaining a successful data culture. Today, we're going to look at training. In our last video on data culture, we looked at motivation and encouragement. We looked at the things that make it more likely for the people inside the community to contribute and to work with data in the ways that we need them to be successful in our work to build a data culture inside our organization. But encouragement and motivation is not enough. People need the training to be successful because we're asking them to do new things that previously they didn't do. When I say training, odds are most of you are thinking about tool training. You're thinking about the guidance and the instruction and the hands-on labs to let people know how to work with Power BI Desktop, how to connect to data sources, how to publish or consume a report. And this is definitely valuable, but it's not the only thing. In addition to tool training, there also needs to be process training. Now, this is something that is often overlooked, but for your data culture, for the work in that managed self-service BI environment that you're working to build, where IT and business groups are working in partnership and where there are clearly defined roles and responsibilities and boundaries between them, as you've been doing this work, you've been defining processes that every contributor will need to align with and follow to one degree or another for your work to be successful. Where are these processes documented? And what training exists to ensure that each stakeholder along the way knows where they fit in and what they need to do to fit in successfully? The tool training is the obvious one. We'll probably circle back to that later, but the process training is probably the next most important aspect of training in a data culture, because if people don't have the resources to understand what processes they need to follow, each user will come up with their own ways to contribute, and this generally does not align with your longer-term goals. The next type of training that can often be overlooked is data source training. Data source training acknowledges that even though as technical professionals we may take for granted that you need a server name or a connection string or an IP address or a DNS name or whatever connection information you need to connect to a given data source, we take that sort of thing for granted. People coming from less technical disciplines may not have the background and the information that they need to understand what they need to get started working with the finance data or the HR data or the supply chain data. They may not know where it lives or how to connect to it. And these are really vital things that to make people be successful, these common tasks both for how to connect, what information is available, at what granularity, how is it designed to be used, and how should it not be used, all of these things need to be taken into consideration as you're putting that data source training together. And if we step back a little, I mentioned that as technical professionals, we take some of these things for granted. But think about the last time that you needed to connect to an SAP HANA system or other complex, multifaceted system where there was a lot of both connection details and technical details that were necessary. It's not always easy, even for the technical personas that your data culture is working to enable. And when you do connect, often the challenges are only just beginning. When I think about connecting to finance data, so again, I work for Microsoft, even though this is my personal YouTube channel, it's not an official aspect of my job. At Microsoft, I sometimes need to connect to internal data sources that for me are bewilderingly complex. There are acronyms and terms that aren't well defined, and for those things, I need to rely on the internal training sites that Microsoft has made available. Finance leaps to mind because Microsoft Finance actually has, and has for decades, for many years, Microsoft Finance has had an internal SharePoint site that includes multiple days worth of dedicated training so that people that need to work with the data inside their finance systems, that they understand where to look for specific data, how to use it successfully, how to validate it, and to understand the processes behind it. There's a lot of work that has gone into this, and this has enabled stakeholders across the organization to be successful using this data, both the managed core and that flexible edge that we looked at in previous videos. Where does this training come from? Some of the training needs to be house-made. And keep in mind, I get all of my stock photos from a free site, and you'd be amazed at how difficult it is to find something that effectively represents in-house developed training. But some of the training that you need to use, you need to develop yourself. This is the data source training. This is the process training. This is all of the training that says how to use the tool in the ways that you are allowed and encouraged or prohibited to, how to not use the tool in ways that you are prohibited to use it in. And for this training, you may need to develop some of it, or you will need to develop some of it yourself. It could be classroom-based training. I know that a lot of organizations will have instructors on staff doing this sort of training for the business groups that they support. It could be online training, which in the world of 2020 is definitely the default or the norm. It could be documentation rather than something that is how we more formally or traditionally think about training. But when you think about the ways that you want people to use your tools, or the ways that different groups in the data culture will interact with each other, this is training that you will need to develop yourself inside the organization. There will always be a need for homemade training content for the things that aren't specific to the tool, but for that tool training, there are two main places that you can get it. Even though a lot of the content in this series on data culture is general, it will apply regardless of the tool that you're using. For this topic, I'm going to talk about some resources that are specific to Power BI. First and foremost, if you go to the Power BI website, and the URL for this specific page is going to be in the links below, if you go to powerbi.com, you will find that there is guided training, there are learning paths for creator, consumer, and developer personas, and there is also documentation, rich documentation that's available that you can use as the building blocks for your tool training content. And this is something that I hear from customer after customer, these large enterprise organizations that I work with day in and day out for my day job, is that a lot of their internal training is a framework that they've provided with their homemade content with links out to the Microsoft documentation, so that anytime that there is a feature that they need people to use or technical detail that they need people to understand, they can simply reference that documentation as part of their internal training content or training path. And for their onboarding, for a new user or new to role user, they will often refer out to either the public Microsoft learning paths that Microsoft has produced, or they will use some of the Microsoft delivered training, like the dashboard in a day type content. The other thing that Power BI has going for it in the context of training is this huge variety of community-developed content. In my day-to-day conversations with these large enterprise customers, I hear time and time again that the work that is done by my colleagues Adam and Patrick for their Guy in a Cube website, that this is something that a lot of enterprise organizations rely on as the core for their community training. And Guy in a Cube has both the free public content, multiple videos every week on YouTube. They have paid, dedicated training content for multiple topics and personas, and they're just one of dozens and dozens of different training providers that are out there with both free and paid content. One of the real strengths of Power BI is its online community. You could take advantage of that by using it as you're building the content and the training that you provide for your users. A question you may be asking is, where does this content live? Where do I put it? And the answer to that is where the people that will be taking the training or working with the training content will find it most easily, because it needs to be accessible. It needs to be where they work every day. If, as an organization, you already have an internal training portal, you have a content management system or learning management system, put your data culture or data stuff training there. So this is where you can have your tool training, your process training, your data source training. Put it there, because that's where your employees, this is where your users are already accustomed to going for training on other topics. Put it there. If you don't have something like that, put your training content as close to the community that you've built as possible. Put it as close to the places where people using Power BI or your other data tools will be in their day-to-day job. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that not every user is the same. So we've talked about motivation in that last video, and in my closing comments I mentioned that different people are motivated in different ways. One thing that I see is that there is usually 10 or 20%, and it's usually closer to 10, maybe even less, but there's maybe 10 or 20% of users inside any population that will go out and they will seek out knowledge. So you'll see those people where they come in and they start using Power BI, and within a week they found the blogs, they found the YouTube channels, they found all of this content, and they're voraciously consuming it themselves, and recognize that they're the exception. They are not the ones that you need to target. What you need to do is you need to make it so that the people that would never go out of their way to seek out a blog or a YouTube channel or the like, that they see this training in their day-to-day life and they don't need to go looking for it. You need to put the content where people work. In our next video, we're going to take a look at what I describe as the art of the possible. We're going to build on this training discussion a little bit more to look at one thing that a lot of organizations often look. But for today, I hope you found this useful. We'll see you next time.